Hello and welcome to episode number 3 of Focus on the Flyers, presented by thehockeywriters.com, where you can follow along on social media and check out other great shows on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform, such as new shows Howlers and Growlers, Prospects Corner, What's Crackin', and more. I'm your co-host, Matt Grazel, and I'm joined by my other co-host, Colin Newby. Well, Colin, we have about another week before the Flyers season opens, but some news broke just a day ago that former Flyers Paul Holmgren and Rick Tocchet will be inducted into the Philadelphia Flyers Hall of Fame during a special ceremony before their game against the Calgary Flames on November 16th at the Wells Fargo Center.
Yep, it's great to hear. Holmgren's been around forever. He's been in pretty much every role you can imagine in the organization. Tocchet was a little before my time as a player, but I do remember his second stint with the Flyers back in the late 90s and I think up to the year 2000.
Yes. And Holmgren had a general manager position with the Flyers several seasons ago. And Rick Tocchet, after his first stint with the Flyers, was traded for another former popular Flyer to the Pittsburgh Penguins. Mark Recchi was acquired.
Yep.
Well, there was 3 games that took place since our last podcast. There was one against Washington, which was a victory, another against Boston, which was an overtime victory, and a loss against the Islanders. The loss or the victory against Washington gave us the what is likely to be the starting lineup for the Flyers as far as a lot of the starters played. What were some of your observations during these 3 games?
So the Saturday game against the Caps, like you said, they played virtually all of their NHL lineup. The Caps didn't have as many starters, which most people are saying the road games, they're not taking as many NHL players in the preseason. But the Flyers won that game 3-1. Some good work, especially by Scott Laughton. I think he had the late goal. It looks like now with the demotion of Morgan Frost, Scott Laughton's going to move to center, so he'll have a little bit of an expanded responsibility coming up in the season. The second game against the Boston Bruins Monday, was lucky enough to be down at the arena for that one. One player I did want to discuss from that game was Nicolas Aube-Kubel, especially in the first period. He had some rushes into the Boston zone, showed a lot of speed, a lot of jump in his skates, and that's what you were really looking for from him. Late in the year last year, he lost favor with the coaching staff a little bit. He was a healthy scratch a couple different times. He took a ton of careless penalties really throughout the season, but late in the year, I think it got to a point where Alain Vigneault had seen enough of it, and he lost his spot in the lineup. You didn't see any of that early in the preseason, and it's something I've been watching for actively. But in the Boston game, I think he got away with a penalty. He didn't get called for it. But with the way they're cracking down on cross-checking, he threw a little bit of a cross-check, and it didn't get called. But in the third game you just mentioned, the loss to the Islanders, Aube-Kubel got 2 minor penalties. He led the team in penalty minutes last year, and this was not some kind of, Dave Schultz, Dave Brown, Donald Brashear type of enforcer penalty minutes. These were careless stick penalties at inopportune times, and he's really got to clean that up if he wants to preserve his spot in the lineup.
Yes, I recall during the offseason, it was a possibility whether he would be the selection by the Kraken in the expansion draft, right. But he also was in some position battles. The injury to Allison kind of makes it more likely that he may be in the lineup, but he also needs to, as you mentioned, not take so many careless penalties.
And go ahead.
I was noticing the faceoff percentages during the Washington game. I believe it was 64%, and in the Boston game it was 51%. So that's a pretty good team percentage for faceoff wins by the Flyers.
Okay, especially a lot of people say that they like to play Giroux and Couturier on the same line so that they can use their dominant hands. That's a real luxury. We've mentioned before how Giroux has transitioned to the wing now that he's probably at the back end of his career. He's still a great face-off man, though. And if they can kind of complement Giroux and Couturier that way, that's great. And I would expect that that would continue through the season.
And you could also use Giroux if you don't use him as a center on 5-on-5. Another option would be possibly on one of the power play units to fill in for Hayes, because Hayes definitely is a vital player, especially on special teams too, that will be missed. I believe Vigneault said he's probably going to miss, I think they said up to 10 games recovering from abdominal surgery. So it's probably going to be a lot of mixing and matching. As you mentioned, I've kind of been going back and forth with this, like who are they going to put in that second spot with the demotion of Frost? And as you mentioned, it could be Lawton. I would probably say Brassard or Lawton, given that, Giroux's on the back end of his career. And if he's more effective at wing, it's probably best to keep him there for the majority of his ice time.
Sure. And as we're recording, it's Friday afternoon. They have a game tonight, but they did release their lineup going into tonight. It has Lawton at center. That's on the third line. I believe it's JVR on one of his wings, possibly Farabee or Lindblom. Lindblom's on the other wing. So if you want to call that the second line, third line, we'll see how much ice time they get. But I would think that's a pretty good indicator that they want to use Lawton in that center role.
And the third line that they had with Brassard, Lindblom, and Atkinson seemed to be pretty effective too. So that wouldn't surprise me to see that line combination together, at least during the opening of the season, given that they put Atkinson down on the bottom six because of his effectiveness as a penalty killer.
Right, and just with so much emphasis on veteran leadership and experience from Fletcher, it seems like he's just pounding that into every press conference. Anything he says on the record, he is trying to talk about veteran leadership. And Brassard is one of the guys that he brought in on a cheap contract. So I do expect they'll put a little bit of trust in him, especially at the beginning of the season. And given the Morgan Frost news that they want to keep him in the AHL, that's likely the root of that too, that they don't trust Frost in a role that he's never played before, and they want him to get his legs under him to where Brassard is a veteran and you know what you're getting out of him.
It was a bit unexpected when they announced the Brassard signing, I recall, but given the unfortunate circumstances with Kevin Hayes, it's kind of a good thing that they brought in a veteran as another body, because they definitely need it now with the because Morgan Frost doesn't appear to be ready given the lack of time that he's played over the past 2 seasons, and
sure.
So we'll see what happens.
Sure. Now, I don't think it's out of the question that Frost gets called up even sooner rather than later. But for now, that's what their plan is. They want to keep him in the AHL. And he's played 2 NHL games over the past year and a half. He hasn't played competitively at another level, only the last couple of preseason games. So for him to have a slow transition in October, November, I don't think it's really going to stunt his growth long term. And I don't think this means all that much for the expectations they have for him, especially in the second half of the season.
Absolutely. Before we transition to our next topic, I want to remind our listeners to sign up for the Morning Skate newsletter with contributions from Kyle Knapp, Christy Flannery, Ben Fisher, Jordan Jacklin, where you can find all your hockey news, trivia, and more. You can also join the Hockey Writers staff on Discord. Our next topic is the Flyers prospects. Our fellow contributor to the Team Flyers, Rob Couch, wrote a prospect article of 3 untouchable prospects for the Flyers. Morgan Frost was included in the article. We've gone at length over the past episode or so about his potential. And
It just seems like the lightning rod topic for all Flyers conversation.
I've recently wrote a news and rumors article that, because of the latest news this week, and Ross was covered because of the news.
Right.
Some of the other prospects were Tyson Forrester and Cam York as well. York made his debut at the end of last season and looked like he was going to provide a spark for the team, given that they were well out of a playoff position at that point, and they were looking to see what their prospects had. He's likely going to be on the outside looking in, given that the Flyers, the signings and the trades they made this offseason with Ryan Ellis, Rasmus Ristolainen, and Keith Yandel. But what are your impressions of Cam York, Colin?
Cam York had a great year last year with Michigan. They had a little bit of complications with COVID at the end of the year, but they had the first 2 overall picks come out of Michigan, Owen Power and Matty Beniers. And then with Cam York on defense, you can imagine how loaded that team was. Coming into the NHL, he might have a slow transition, kind of in the same way that we just talked about Frost, but he looks like a promising puck-moving defenseman. As you just mentioned, they did sign Keith Yandel, and he's going to play that role, especially early in the season. I thought that he looked tremendous on the power play in training camp and preseason, just as kind of that distributor for guys like Giroux, Konechny, Couturier. So I do expect that he'll have a solidified spot in the lineup, which kind of pushes York to the AHL, at least in the meantime. But I don't think it's out of the question we could see him at some point during the season either. And that, again, goes along the lines of what we just said about Morgan Frost. York's a very talented guy. He was drafted, I think, 14th overall. The story is that everybody wanted Cole Caulfield, who went a pick behind him and is now looking great for Montreal. But the book really hasn't even started on Cam York yet, so we can't count that as a busted draft pick or anything, because Cam York has shown some promise. Probably not NHL ready at the moment, but his skill, it does speak for itself out on the ice.
Yes, and he most likely bumps up the spot at the defense position if injured forward defenseman Samuel Morin, given the injury to him, it would probably bump up York spot on the order if they were going to use Morin on the defense.
Absolutely. And York will be sent to the AHL, though. Just with a prospect, you want him playing regularly. He's not going to be a 7th defenseman that the team will carry and scratch all the time. It's better for him to develop. But in the event of injuries and you want somebody to jump right into the lineup, that's something I could see him doing.
And they also, the acquisition of Ryan Ellis by the Flyers this offseason, he had his experience on the as the point man for a power play unit with Nashville. So in addition to Yandel, Ellis could be he could be the point man for the second power play unit.
Sure, it's a crowded blue line in
Sure.
terms of the power play. Yandel and Ellis, Provorov and Rasmus Ristolainen have also played a decent amount of power play time in their careers. So we'll see how that shakes out. But for now, it does look like Yandel's going to be on the first unit.
And given that a lot of power play units, they usually only put on one defenseman. So I believe the Flyers have four forwards, but I believe it's Connecting who's the other technically defenseman on the power play unit.
Right.
Next, we want to discuss Claude Giroux, the longtime Philadelphia Flyer, is in the last year of his 8-year contract, and our colleague Bobby Bader wrote an article about the Flyers' options and Giroux's option for this season regarding whether he will be in his last year as a Flyer, or he could sign a new deal or be traded during the season, depending on how it shakes out. Colin, what is your prediction and your thoughts of what could unfold with Giroux this season?
Well, my prediction is really looking through a lens of that I think the team is going to improve a lot from last year. And in the event that happens, I think Giroux stays. He hasn't given any kind of indication that he wants to leave Philadelphia. They haven't exactly given him the best roster to work with during his captaincy. That began in the 2012-13 season. And that was kind of the range where the Flyers entered a rebuild in kind of a salary cap disaster. And he just hasn't had the depth around him throughout his career. But he still loves the organization. He hasn't said that he wants to leave. He hasn't given any signs that he's disgruntled. That being said, and Bobby put this very well in the article, if they're not in contention, it's plausible to see that he could get traded at the deadline on the last year of his deal. If we're not going to be in Stanley Cup contention here, that's the Flyers not being in Stanley Cup contention, then why wouldn't he want to go to a contender? It's only logical at this point in his career. He hasn't been on a Stanley Cup team since back in 2010 at the very beginning of his career. It's hard to imagine the Flyers without Claude Giroux at this point. But yeah, it's not out of the question that his time here is running short.
Yes, and he's one of the other players, like former Flyer Jake Voracek, who could be in line for a change of scenery. He's certainly been here been with the Flyers more than anybody on the roster. So I think he would definitely be a good contribution to an elite team if he were to be traded, such as Vegas, Colorado, Boston, or any team like that, where I think it enhances his game when he's not has to be the pressure of being the number one guy.
That's absolutely it with him.
Yeah. Whereas he started his career here, he wasn't the number one guy. They had Jeff Carter and Mike Richards. And I thought he was more effective in the year when they went to the Stanley Cup against Chicago. So, I definitely think whether he may just prefer that change of scenery and just say, look, I want to win a championship. I think the Flyers will be better, but I don't think they're not at Stanley Cup contention yet. So if there's an opportunity that arises, and I think a lot of teams will be interested, especially if it were to be for a rental, because they could do that. A team could do that, such as Vegas or a another elite team. And then he could test free agency next year, or could test, if he remains with the Flyers throughout the season, could decide that he wants to do that this next year. So I think there's definitely a lot of there's still sort of there's a lot of talent there with Giroux, but I think it's more if he's on a more of a reserve role as opposed to being the pressure of being having to be one of the top 3-point producers for the team, because I think that's going to be less and less with each passing year throughout his the rest of his career. So
yeah, and in that case, a lot of his future will depend on what happens around him rather than his performance individually also. And I think you're absolutely right. He's better off as a secondary performer and not the guy that put up 102 points back in the 17-18 season.
mm-hmm.
It's weird with Claude Giroux. His career trajectory is just pretty uncommon in general. To at least a casual Philadelphia sports fan, he's not the most beloved guy. He hasn't won a championship as the captain. He hasn't led many deep playoff runs, other than at the beginning of his career, which you already said, he wasn't really the main focus of the team at that point. But he is through the decade between 2010 and 2020. I think he was 4th in the NHL in points. So that consistency, there's a lot to be said for that. And the fact that the Flyers haven't put enough around him is a real shame. So you would not want to see the career of a guy like that wasted and any Stanley Cup opportunities thrown out the window. But unfortunately, as you said, if they're not in contention at the trade deadline again, it might be what ends up happening, and you see him go to another team where he might have a better chance to compete.
And as you said, they spent several years of his prime in a rebuild. So you're still sorting things out as far as what works and what doesn't work with the roster. And you have a player in Giroux in his prime, and he's trying to figure out, okay, what players are going to work with him and what aren't. So you don't really necessarily have a sustaining core around him like you had with, say, Patrice Bergeron in Boston with Brad Marchand, and now David Pastrnak, or with the Chicago Blackhawks with Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane. So it should be interesting to see what Giroux happens with Giroux, because he can surpass another famous Flyer, now retired Eric Lindros this year in goals. I believe Giroux only needs 17, and he should be able to get that amount. He's still producing at a high enough of a level where he should pass Lindros for team goals and advance even closer for the Flyers team lead. And he's played 82 games in several years of his career, so he's definitely durable. I believe he had a streak snapped during last year because of during the COVID-19 outbreak. That was the only reason his game streak was snapped. So if he were to go somewhere else, the team would be getting a good bargain, to say the least, and helping whatever franchise he went to get closer to a championship.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even a question. He's one of the best Flyers ever. Lindros at his peak might have been better than Giroux, but Giroux's had more longevity because Lindros had so many injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And Claude Giroux's moving up through the record books very quickly. And yeah, one of the best Flyers ever. So the fact that they haven't given him the chance, like we said, it's a real shame. But he's given his all to this organization.
Mm-hmm. In closing, Kyle, I just wanted to get your thoughts on what your going to be looking for the Flyers' last preseason game tonight or on Friday evening against the Washington Capitals?
As we mentioned, the big news this week, the lightning rod topic was Morgan Frost. But what didn't get mentioned all that much in the shuffle was the fact that they kept Jackson Cates and Garrett Wilson on the roster. So one of them is probably going to get the final forward spot and start the season in the bottom six. Cates he was signed as a college free agent last year. He played with the UMD Bulldogs, and he's the older brother of Noah Cates, who's a prospect in the organization. The bottom six is probably his NHL ceiling, but they feel he's at least nearly ready, if not ready, to crack the opening night roster. And then Wilson is more of a physical player. I know that he fought Sam Moran one time down in the AHL, and the Flyers have put a little bit of an emphasis on toughness in the offseason. I don't think you're going to dress somebody specifically to fight, but if he can bring a physical presence on the forecheck and provide a little bit of that tenacity and a strong element to the game, then maybe they'll go for Wilson. So we'll see how he does tonight. I think he's dressing on the fourth line. So that'll probably determine what they're trying to do with that last roster spot headed into the regular season.
And I read in pieces by Jordan Hall, who covers the Flyers for NBC Sports Philadelphia, as well as a piece in The Athletic by Charlie O'Connor, who covers the Flyers for that online platform. And they said, become familiar with Jackson Cates. And with Cates, it could, they decide to keep him for opening night. It could open up more of a spot where they had Brassard or Lawton as the second line center. And you don't necessarily have that mixing and matching by having one less center if they weren't going to keep Cates. So that is something to keep an eye on over the next week as well. That's going to do it for this week's edition of Focus on the Flyers. Remember, you can sign up for a morning skate at morningskate.io, as well as join the hockey writers on Discord at the Hockey Lounge, and check out all the other great shows on the Hockey Writers Podcast Network, including Chicks and Sticks, Blackhawks Banner, Saber Scoop, and more. For my co-host, Colin Newby, I'm Matt Grazel. Thank you, and make sure to tune in next week's episode as we preview the Flyers' upcoming season. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.